reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity. This is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host, Cora. Thank you so very, very much for joining me. It is absolutely wonderful to see you. Hop on in here. Let's grab a coffee together or a hot chocolate. Or, hey, if you're feeling outrageous, maybe mix the two and make a mocha. It's great to see you. Jump on in here. Let's talk about gender diversity. And this week, episode 40, how do we get here? This week, much like we do every time we come together, we take a comment or public statement, often confidently declared from a public figure, sometimes a famous book author, sometimes the president of the United States. I say that every day, like sometimes the president of the United States. I don't think we've actually had Donald Trump prompt us yet, but it's coming. It's coming. You just wait. It is coming. But this week we have Luke Ball speaking on GB News. GB News needs no introduction. A little bit of a right-wing news outlet in the UK. The UK's equivalent of Fox News, some might say. But this, they often will talk about gender diversity in some confident terms. And in this instance, Luke Ball is being interviewed to talk about women in prisons, particularly transgender women in prisons. So here is Luke Ball.
President Trump has signed an executive order that bans transgender women from entering female prisons. Is that correct?
That is the correct amount of action that must be taken because there are only two genders and it is defined by your birth. It is science. It is biological. And whenever you have these instances wherever somebody says they're a trans person, particularly a man who says that he is a woman, the basic policy under the Biden administration is that all of the other women or all of the women have to lay down their rights to accommodate this man who says that he is a woman. That not only is very abhorrent to the women themselves, but it also detracts from the entire purpose of the military, this fighting force that must be prepared, must be ready to go out and fight. So I think that it is the correct and appropriate action to take because otherwise it just detracts from the main mission.
And what about the argument from some that transgender women, which is in other words men, they would be threatened in male prisons? This isn't a safe place for them.
Well, to that argument, I would say that there could probably be accommodations made to where they aren't in general population. But again, that is because it is a single instance of somebody that comes out and says, hey, I am a man, but I feel like I'm a woman or something of that nature, does not mean that all of the women, the biological women who are in the other prison population, have to lay down all of their rights and be subjected to this individual who is being put in with the other women. I mean, you've even seen some articles over the last few weeks of instances where that has caused sexual abuse on behalf of the person that says that they are a woman in women's prison, and that can't happen. So if we have to isolate individuals or put them outside of general population, maybe that's a solution if somebody comes forward and says this. But it doesn't mean that we have to accommodate all of these different individuals who come out and say this and at the expense of other individuals' rights, just try to make that a situation that works for them.
Thanks so very much to Luke Ball for such an interesting question posed, as they often are, in the form of confident declaration. But we will take it for the question we're sure is intended to be. Luke Ball, thanks so very much. I realise that, in response to the first part of this question, Luke Ball starts talking randomly about the military. That's pretty fun. Should transgender women be housed in women's prisons? No, because it detracts from the purpose of the mission. But we'll take it. Listen, hey, we all misspeak, Luke. Please don't take offense. We'll take your question. We'll take your question for the question we're sure it was intended to be, and we'll see if we can't find an answer together. So should transgender women be housed in women's prisons? What do you do with transgender people in prison, and what are their experiences of prison? That is going to be our question for today. There's a health warning for this episode, everyone. A health warning that, in all of our episodes, like Classroom Psychology, if this is the first time you've come here, welcome. Good episode for you to jump in on. But if this is not your first time here, then, you will know that we talk pretty openly about the research on gender diversity, and the vast majority of the research talks about the challenges that transgender people experience and gender diverse people more broadly. And that often includes things like sexual assault. It includes things like suicide and self-harm. It includes the mental health challenges. It includes marginalization experiences, all kinds of stuff. But when we're talking about prison, we're really turning up that to 11. The experiences of prisoners in prisons, particularly in the US, but we are going to talk about in the UK too. There's some research that's been done specifically on UK prisons, which is super interesting. But really around the world, we find that transgender folk in prison have a really, really, really tough time. And some of their experiences are pretty difficult to listen to. So this whole episode, we're going to be talking about quite challenging topics, particularly around sexual assault and sexual abuse. We're going to be talking a lot about violence in prison. We're going to talk a lot about the challenges of solitary confinement. We're going to talk about self-harm and suicidality, and we are going to talk about the challenges of being marginalized in a system that wasn't built with you in mind. So we are really going to get into it. As always, we will take a look at this literature. I took a look at all the literature I could find on trans folk in prison. As we always do, review the literature, take a look in the same kind of way I do for a brief systematic review. And I'm going to review the literature with you today. And thankfully, we have the absolutely extraordinary advantage of having other systematic reviews to draw on here, because there are some extraordinary researchers in this field doing amazing research to the extent that systematic reviews are possible. So that is a wonderful thing. It does mean that there's enough literature in this field for us to get a good sense of an answer to this particular question. So here we go. Our first study is legendary Brooke, Biernat, Chamaris, and Sekaret in 2022. The experience of transgender women prisoners serving a male sentence. Experiences transgender women prisoners serving a sentence in a male prison. A systematic review. Now, the first thing we got to say, so this is the vast majority in the US. They brought together 14 different studies. Most of them were completed in the US. Some were in Latin America, Australia, England, and Scotland, but most in the US in this systematic review. Now, bearing in mind that this systematic review can't comment on the number or proportion of prisoners housed in male prisoners for transgender women, this is focused on the experiences of transgender women like serving a sentence in a male prison. So they've made that kind of assumption right from the start. We'll come to the proportion later. But in these studies, the first thing they find, deep breath, everyone. This is going to be very tricky. We're going to reference some direct quotations. The first thing they find in this systematic review of 14 studies is that sexual abuse in prison was a common experience for transgender women prisoners in a male prison, and was described by some transgender folk as a way of life. Transgender women prisoners identified the constant sexual abuse from other prisoners, identifying them as kind of prison whores. Forgive the language, that's a direct quotation from a transgender woman prisoner. And one transgender woman described, "They think I'm a slut because I have breasts. We're prison whores. That's how we are seen, especially if we have breasts." Transgender women in this systematic review described being, forgive me, we are going to talk about sexual assault. So, deep breath. This is where things get a bit tricky, and the whole episode is going to be like this. Deepest apologies, but it is important. As I take a second to say why we do this, it is important because when people say, like our amazing question asker, Luke Ball, when Luke says, yes, transgender women should be housed in male prisons, but there's a way to keep them safe. This is why we need to talk about this in stark terms, because this is just the truth of people's experience, right? So many transgender women prisoners talked about being violently raped or of witnessing rape in prison. They talk about a sense of fatalism, that it was better to allow sexual advances and non-consensual sex because turning down sexual advances could result in something more physically violent. In these situations, trans women talk about swearing, putting people down, ignoring it, or developing kind of flirtatious responses to manage these kind of advances. And some transgender women talk about using physical violence, kind of taking what they described in inverted commas as a time out from being a lady, and responding with physical violence to try and get some respect and reduce further incidences of sexual assault or sexual advances. Which is wild, right? It's not at all surprising, but it is kind of horrifying. Transgender women also talked about kind of their experiences of being placed in solitary confinement or special units at some point during their incarceration. Trans women were talking about being placed in solitary confinement for a minimum of 14 days, but on many occasions it could become indefinite. And in one study in Rosenberg and Oswin, they talk about the average length of placement in solitary confinement of being 1.8 years. Huge length of time to be in solitary confinement. Now, these transgender women also talked about having difficulty accessing their hormones or transition-related healthcare while they're in prison. Transgender women talked about kind of discrimination from healthcare professionals, and they considered that while being in prison, the gender binary was kind of reinforced by prison institution generally and by the healthcare professionals therein. They talk about healthcare professionals applying male pronouns to trans women prisoners in an attempt to kind of reinforce that gender binary. And some prisoners talked about people saying things like, "You're not a girl, you're a he," and being persistently called a he was described as like a knife to your side. Transgender women described the deterioration in their mental health while in prison, understandably, and some transgender women occasionally described self-surgical treatment, so surgical self-treatment to achieve gender realignment occasionally, which is obviously horrifying. One transgender woman said this: "I'm depressed most of the time, not being able to express my true self and still being in the wrong body. Not being comfortable in my appearance. I have crying fits often for no reason, and I forego eating so I won't have to be around other people because I'm ashamed of my looks." There is one other systematic review it's worth us talking about. Marchi, Corbellini, Vaccari, Pingani, Ferrari, and Amadeo, and colleagues, in fact, quite a lot of colleagues in 2023, Mental Health of Transgender People in Prison, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. So this is mental health of transgender people in prison, not specifically transgender women in male prison. They brought together 13 studies, all in the USA except one, which was from Canada. So this is basically a systematic review of USA experiences of transgender people in prison and their mental health, which is really interesting and really important. And the first thing they find is that in the majority of cases, transgender folk are housed in prison based on their sex assigned at birth rather than on their gender identity in the majority of cases, which is itself, right? That alone, nothing else, that is huge. Because what we found in the other systematic review is that particularly for transgender women, the experience when housed in male prisons is one that's characterized by sexual assault, sexual abuse, violence, and poor access to healthcare. So it's a real disaster that most transgender people are housed based on their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity. That's a huge challenge to transgender folks' gender identity being recognized, of course. It erodes their personal dignity, the authors say, and it increases marginalization and isolation. So importantly, these studies didn't just focus on transgender women. 4 of them were focused on both trans women and trans men. 1 was focused on trans men specifically, and 1 of them didn't specify. Now, these authors were able to conduct a meta-analysis, which basically allows them to do some stats to make some claims about what the relationship is between being trans and mental health outcomes, for example. So their meta-analysis means that they can say broadly across all of these studies, they demonstrate that transgender individuals, transgender inmates, are at an increased risk of mental illness, an increased risk of PTSD, an increased risk of suicide attempts. Now, you've got to bear in mind that in most of the research, it's very difficult to talk about suicide attempts. You can talk more easily about suicidal ideation. When you're talking about prison, you can record every suicide attempt because those are in prison and people see them happen, right? They are discovered. So there are records, and therefore you can make some statements about suicide attempts here. And for sure, transgender inmates are at an increased risk of suicide attempts in prison. Conversely, transgender inmates were not more likely than controls, than non-transgender inmates. They weren't an increased risk of anxiety disorders, of alcohol abuse or substance abuse, bearing in mind that there weren't many studies that looked at those things specifically. They also found that in this meta-analysis, only 50 to 70% of participants of transgender inmates have access to gender-affirming hormones. So we have huge problems here, right? Huge problems with transgender inmates having an increased risk of mental illness, depression, PTSD, and suicide attempts, and they face increased challenges in accessing gender-affirming hormones. And in the systematic review, one study, Drakeford's in 2018, found that adequate transgender-related healthcare services were protective, in that the lack of adequate transgender-related healthcare was associated with an increased risk of suicide attempts in transgender inmates. Which is not surprising, but is pretty dire given how difficult it is for transgender inmates to access gender-affirming hormones. In Jaffa and colleagues, Rosenhol and colleagues both find that they had an estimate of the active denial of hormone replacement treatment being around 20%. So 20% of participants had experienced active denial of access to hormone replacement treatment. That's huge, right? That's 1 in 5 had their hormone replacement actively denied. Which you've got to bear in mind that these are trans folk. We've already talked about how gender affirming hormones, how transition related healthcare saves lives. Like it is protective in terms of mental health, as we find here, right? Drakeford finds that lack of adequate transition related healthcare is associated with increased risk of suicide attempts in this population in prison. So this is a huge, huge problem in the American system in particular. Now we go on to Bromdahl, Mullins, Phillips and Gao in 2018, experiences of transgender prisoners and their knowledge, attitudes and practices regarding sexual behaviors and HIV/STIs, a systematic review published in the International Journal of Transgenderism. They brought together 11 studies in the final sample, most from the USA, barring 2 which were from Australia, and they were focused on sexual behaviors fundamentally. But they did find a lot of the stuff that we have already found in other systematic reviews. They found that people had extraordinary difficulty accessing medical treatment for gender-affirming healthcare, that this population of prisoners experienced heightened vulnerability, increased mental health issues, and sometimes experienced secondary harm from those mental health issues and their gender dysphoria, with some prisoners engaging in self-harm, such as self-treatment in an attempt to cope with their gender dysphoria, like self-surgical treatment in some rare cases, and with some other prisoners attempting suicide or exaggerating mental health symptoms or refusing medication in an attempt to get medical attention for their gender dysphoria. Transgender prisoners talked about interpersonal violence, including sexual assault, a lack of respect, discrimination, mistreatment, harassment, and stigma from both prison staff and other prisoners, often related to gender and or sexuality, including homophobia. There's a lot of lack of knowledge and confusion among prison staff, people having a great deal of difficulty understanding how gender identity and expression is related but distinct from sexual orientation, mistaking trans folk for being gay frequently. And ultimately, of course, this is a study about sex and sexual behaviors. So people talked about a lot of complexity when it came to sexual and intimate relationships, with participants talking about like seeking relationships as a means of protection and to reduce the chances of getting assaulted or victimized from other prisoners. And it's quite complex because some people talked about things like getting into relationships that seemed consensual at the time and that they only later realized were kind of there to keep themselves safe. They engaged in actions that would keep themselves safe, which is kind of understandable when participants were talking about things like experiencing forced sex due to their gender identity, being both sold for sex and being part of exchange sex. So kind of exchanging sex for the things they need to survive, whether it be protection, food, money, drugs, or whatever they need to survive. People talked about doing what they needed to do to survive, whether it be about, using exchange sex or whereby engaging in complex sexual relationships, by engaging in coercive and transactional sex to facilitate survival, by staying in areas they knew were video surveilled and monitored by custodial staff to stay safe. These are people in extraordinary vulnerability. Really, it's very difficult to describe just how vulnerable this population really is in prison. Next up, we go to Van Hoe, Cooley and Hillis in 2020, Contemporary Transgender Health Experience and Health Situation in Prisons, a scoping review of extant published literature, 2019, in the International Journal of Transgender Health, one of my favorite journals. They brought together a bunch of, so they weren't just like interested in the published literature, they're interested in everything. 23 empirical studies were in there, 23 commentaries, 8 literature reviews, 2 reports, a book chapter, a case study, and a set of conference slides all made it in, which meant that they were able to look very widely. They brought sort of research and work together, not only from the US, but also from the UK, Australia, Brazil, Canada, Hong Kong, and Italy were all represented in the data corpus. And they took a look to understand essentially what was the experience of transgender folk, what is their health experience and health situations in prisons around the world. Now, this is the one, folks. This is a classic review. It's absolutely brilliant. If you are looking for an introduction to transgender people in prison, not surprising, it comes from the International Journal of Transgender Health. We've published there before, and it was a hell of a day. We popped some bubbly on that day when we did, because it's a cracking journal. This is a cracking study. So if you are looking for an overview of transgender people's experience in prison across the world, then Van Hoe and colleagues are absolutely the place to go. This is a very cool study. It's pretty harrowing. They talk about the challenges primarily across the world, particularly in countries where it's commonplace in the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and Ireland, where entry into a male or female prison is determined primarily by the individual's external genitalia and or their sex assigned at birth. Now, in these situations, it's very tricky because most incarcerated people have not had surgery, and so their external physical genitalia doesn't represent their gender identity, it represents their sex assigned at birth, and so they are in a challenge where they get commonly placed in a prison associated with their sex assigned at birth rather than their gender identity. Now, these authors found that it is very rare that prisoners are given the opportunity to choose their prison placement, but in some US, UK, Canadian, and Australian institutions, there is a bit more of a case-by-case approach. In the UK, that is quite common, that there's a case-by-case approach. We're going to talk about it in a moment. There's one study that looks specifically in the UK, and it's a really good opportunity for us to see how the UK system diverges. And indeed, these authors talk about how that is a much preferred opportunity, right? Because it gives the opportunity for transgender people to be considered on a case-by-case basis about which prison is right for them. Now, these authors highlight that that's very uncommon, and that a much more common solution to transgender housing is, as our question asker suggested, is that they put them in segregated housing They put them in segregation wings or in solitary confinement. Now, while prison officials obviously argue that this is to protect the transgender people from harm, these authors say the social psychological deprivation experienced by solitary confinement, which is a tool used for punishment, is arguably inhumane, they say. They also say that there's an additional challenge here because the people who are most frequently placed in solitary confinement across the world are people of color, particularly Black, Latinx, mixed race, and Native American or First Nations transgender inmates. In fact, transgender inmates of color were more than twice as likely to be placed in solitary confinement. The authors describe how this is now the solution that's pretty common in many prisons in the US, Australia, and Canada, though it is less common in the UK in some Canadian and Australian prisons, where they instead incarcerate transgender people in specialist wards or pods more frequently that are designed to be able to address the needs of transgender prisoners. Although in Macaulay and colleagues, specialist wings that are used to house transgender prisoners are used to house all prisoners with vulnerabilities and challenges, and that incarcerated transgender people frequently report feeling equally vulnerable in these facilities as they do elsewhere. The authors also report that there's generally pretty poor access to transgender-related healthcare for prisoners. They talk about people getting very poor access for evaluation, experiencing the cessation of hormone therapy while in prison staff being deliberately indifferent to the needs of transgender people. And they found that in a study of 50 US states, this is Ruth and colleagues, 30 of those states prohibited counseling consults for incarcerated transgender people, 27 didn't initiate hormone treatment, and 20 out of 50 US states discontinued hormone treatment for transgender people, potentially causing enormous problems for those people. And they found, amazingly, that only 8 states allowed gender-affirming surgery, which is extraordinary, right? Absolutely extraordinary. The authors make this really interesting point that while many prisons do support the use of hormone treatment, or some prisons support the use of hormone treatment, they still require the transgender person to provide evidence of an official diagnosis and of legitimate hormone prescription prior to incarceration. But they make the point that people prior to incarceration are often from poor communities, and most people don't have access to secure hormone treatments through legitimate, in inverted commas, sources, and instead secure them through the black market due to high cost of prescriptions. And so they can't demonstrate a treatment history and diagnosis on entry to prison, and cannot access the hormones which have become necessary in their life to maintain their physical well-being, right? Not to mention their psychological well-being. Now, finally, these authors talk once again about the risk of sexual and physical violence to transgender people within the prison settings. They talk about this being apparent in all countries and contexts, and they talk about rates of abuse, which I think is fascinating. So they talk about the US, the UK, Canada, and Australia all consistently reporting incarcerated transgender people to be sexually and physically victimized at a far greater rate than the general population. They talk about in one Californian prison, which was looked at by Jenness and colleagues, they found that reported sexual assault was 13 times more prevalent for incarcerated transgender individuals than others, and with 59% of incarcerated transgender people having experienced a sexual assault while in prison. Colopy and colleagues talked about in their paper that 59% of transgender incarcerated individuals reported experiences of sexual assault while in prison more broadly, compared with 4% of the general prison population, which is harrowing, right? Absolutely legitimately harrowing. So what we find is that transgender people across the world, when they're incarcerated, are at extraordinary risk of physical violence, of sexual assault, of coercion, of discrimination, and of poor access to healthcare around the world. Now, as we talked about, there is some glimmers of hope here, that there are some slightly better systems out there that we might be able to learn from. And one of them is the UK system. Now, to understand UK prison experiences, we go to Nolte and colleagues in 2019. I'm not different. I'm still a human being, but I am different. An exploration of the experiences of transgender prisoners using interpretative phenomenological analysis in the Journal of Forensic Practice. This is a cool study. So, we do love a bit of a qualitative study here. IPA is a really good way to understand somebody's experience, deeply contextualized in their life. And that's really important here. I think it's a cool approach. They brought together 3 transgender prisoners in the UK, each identified as female, and each had been living in Category C and Category B male establishments while living as a female in the UK, which is wild, right? So all these folk housed in male prisons, even though they are living while in the male prisons as a woman, which is, I honestly, literally, listen, I literally can't imagine it. Like, I'm sitting here, like, trying to put myself in their shoes in some way, like these transgender women, what it would be like. It's already like, it would be harrowing for me to use a male restroom, right? Like, just to go for a wee in a men's room alongside a bunch of dudes. Like, I think that would be pretty horrifying, and it would cause a huge amount of gender dysphoria for me to be forced into a space like that. And these transgender women are being housed in men's prisons alongside a whole bunch of dudes while living as women. Like, I just literally can't imagine what the experience must be like. It actually is it makes me laugh with a slight nervous laugh, because I can't imagine it. Now, these folk had all been living openly as female for between 5 and 7 years, and had all been referred to and were all engaging with gender identity clinic services. So these were, transgender women living as women in the world, housed in men's prisons, average age of 43 years of age, and all between the age of 25 and 53. Now, under prison instruction, these authors highlight, I didn't know this in the UK, the default position is that an individual is placed in a prison establishment on the basis of their legal gender. Now, in the UK, legal gender is a bit of a fudgy concept, right? We have something called the Gender Recognition Act, which means that transgender people can get legal, in inverted commas, recognition of their gender by applying to a panel of experts and acquiring what is essentially a gender recognition certificate. Now, I am a girl in the world, right? I've been trans for a very long time, my whole life, but I've been out for 10 years, and I have changed my gender marker on my passport, on my everything, on my driver's license, on my records online, on my medical records, on everything, except my birth certificate. And I don't have a gender recognition certificate. Now, in part because I'm not the biggest fan of the idea that a panel of judges who are legal and medical experts can make a decision about my gender. But I have now applied for one. So I have applied for one. So, and this is the reason why, because there's more rhetoric around the concept of legal gender, and I'm a little bit concerned that at some point I might need one to just be able to get by in the world in a way that hasn't been necessary until now. So I have applied for one. You have to gather a huge number of pieces of evidence. Like, I submitted about 20 documents, including medical records, including my birth certificate, my marriage certificate, deed poll. Kaz and I had to go in front of a solicitor and make statutory declarations. I solemnly declare kind of legal declarations and sign a bunch of stuff, and it was crazy. And then I had to provide a bunch of evidence of living, in inverted commas, in role, which it's wild. It's kind of fun because I'm like, I just submit a bunch of publications, a bunch of scientific articles I'm an author on. Look, Cora exists. But But even though I have submitted it, they've sent me a letter saying, thanks very much, we will get to your application in approximately 30 weeks. So I have to wait 7 months even for them to look at it. So the idea that transgender women are placed in a prison establishment on the basis of their legal gender means that if I were arrested today, I would be placed in a male prison, which terrifies me just as well. I'll try and get my gender recognition certificate before I commit any crimes, or at least before I get caught. It's a very strange experience. Listen, I haven't committed any crimes. Please don't come and find me. Wait until my gender recognition certificate comes through. Please. Listen, but that's amazing. However, in the UK, transgender service users are asked for their view regarding the part of the prison estate, male or female, that would be best suited to their gender identity. So if they would prefer a part of the estate that's not congruent with their legal gender, i.e. the gender on their birth certificate, then they bring together a transgender case board within 3 days of arrival in custody, and preferably at the pre-sentence stage. I'm making some direct quotations from the article here. And this allows professionals to work alongside the service user to make a decision on the placement and to review the individual's additional needs as a transgender service user. For example, safety, access to correctly gender clothing, makeup, hair removal, etc., right? Now, the prison service guides the risk to an individual and to other service users as key in their decision making, right? So the prison service has a common sense approach. It has an opportunity for people to be housed in the sort of area of the prison that is most appropriate to their gender identity through the use of a transgender case board, even if they don't have a gender recognition certificate. But the default position is that an individual is placed in the prison establishment on the basis of their legal gender. This is under Prison Service Instruction 17. Now, regardless of this, these are the experiences of these 3 transgender women who were all housed in men's prisons, even though they were living as women in the world, right? Now, we don't know why they were housed in men's prisons. We don't know the decision that was made. All we know is that they were. And these are direct quotations from them from this piece of research. I'm going to make some direct quotations. We are going to talk about sexual assault, of course, and we're going to talk about some pretty difficult experiences. So take care of yourselves. Here is some direct quotes from these 3 transgender women in prison. I was raped, she says. They said I must like it because I'm gay. I'm not gay. They treat us like we're lepers, like we shouldn't be here. I call the male prisoners the paparazzi, as they are just all around you all the time. You can't get away from them. Each participant, says the authors of the study, spoke about daily sexual comments and innuendos. Direct quotation from participant again. It's like I'm a piece of meat. Every day I get comments like, give us a blowjob. On my way here, 2 guys were saying those things to me. I call them on it. They are only doing it to look big in front of their mates, so I make them look stupid. Direct threats, say the authors, of sexual violence were reported to be less common than the harassment and viewed more severely, evoking a higher level of fear and anxiety. Direct quotation, I've had people threaten to rape me, tell me that they're going to get me in my cell, and it does scare me. But these participants also describe opportunities for prison officers to affirm their experience. And here's a direct quotation of that, which might give us some sense of how we can better serve these prisoners. There have been 2 members of staff, direct quotation, who really took the time to get to know me and wanted to know more about who I am. I'm still grateful to them. The staff members, say the authors, who demonstrated interest and acceptance were valued by each participant. Direct quotation, an officer said to me, sorry, I don't know how to address you. So we sat and had a conversation about it. He might not be completely okay with all things trans, but we can communicate, and I appreciate that. So there is huge opportunity for prison staff to be able to to improve the lives of transgender inmates in an extraordinary, challenging situation for transgender people. Just one or two people, often correctional officers, who are a little bit more affirming, a little bit more welcoming, who listen, who try to make people feel welcome. They clearly have a bit of an effect. Now, Van Hu and colleagues in 2020, we already talked about their study, but one of the things that they found in their systematic review was that when incarcerated transgender people experience prison and correctional staff using the correct pronouns, they experience an improved sense of well-being, of course. Now, to get people to that place is quite tricky, but White, Hutu, and Clark and Hutu both, that is the same author. It's two groups, same author. They piloted a transgender health training for prison staff in the US. It's a really cool intervention. It's kind of grounded in behavioral change theory. It was designed to improve people's competencies, to try to explore people's experiences, to give people a sense of who transgender people are, to hear from transgender people's experiences, and to kind of include lectures, discussions, role-playing, and case studies which address the experience of being trans in the criminal justice system. Talks about healthcare interactions, talks about tailored medical care, and is designed to help people to integrate gender-affirming language and practice, such as preferred pronouns, into people's professional lives. And what they find is this, direct quotation: providers indicated that the training provided them with the required cultural competencies to provide care to transgender patients and basic competencies for gender-affirming clinical interactions. So there is an opportunity here. So let's do our best. I think we're getting there, right? Let's do our best to provide a bit of a response to Luke Ball. Luke Ball, thanks so much for the question. Fascinating as it was. Where should transgender people be housed? I don't know. I'm just not that qualified to be able to comment on where they should be housed. But I will say this, that transgender people are at incredible risk. They are at incredible risk in prison, and that transgender women in particular housed in men's prisons seem to be at extraordinary risk of sexual assault, of cruel and unusual punishment in the US prison system and worldwide, it seems, and that there is a huge unmet need for this population in terms of protection, in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of inclusive and accessible practice, but most of all, in terms of keeping them safe. They just seem very unsafe, and their emotional well-being, their physical well-being is at incredible risk. And I have to say that, that's not unknown, right? This research, in a lot of the areas that we talk about, and a lot of the areas that we do our work and, look at the literature, we'll often find that the literature just isn't that good. We did an episode on puberty blockers not that long ago, and the research is appalling, right? It's 5 studies. But when we're talking about this isn't an unknown, right? It isn't unknown that transgender people are at extraordinary risk in the criminal justice system, particularly in the US, but worldwide. And there's systematic reviews on this topic. Not even, there's tons of systematic reviews we've covered here, all of which consistently show through countless studies that transgender people are at extraordinary danger, particularly transgender women in men's prisons. But, I don't know that you don't know that. The only thing that I can suggest is that either people don't know or people don't care, because transgender prisoners are imprisoned and therefore deserve this as some kind of punishment. I don't know if people think that. I don't know, but we shouldn't think that, because transgender people, people commit crimes and they deserve to be in prison. But when they're in prison, they shouldn't be subjected to cruel and unusual punishment, and they shouldn't be subjected to sexual or physical assault. They shouldn't be in a situation where they are unsafe, where they're hurting themselves, or where they're at risk of taking their own lives. We shouldn't be in a position where that's the case. And not only that, but the research clearly shows that there are very simple steps that we can take to prevent that from being the case. the UK system has embedded into the system an opportunity for transgender people to appeal to a panel to help them to decide about where is safest for them and for everyone else for them to be housed, which is much better, like a case-by-case approach, surely much better than a blanket ban on transgender women accessing the spaces that are right for them. Surely a case-by-case basis. We're not suggesting that they shouldn't have careful and thoughtful consideration placed on where they are housed, and that it might not always be safe for them to be housed in female prisons. We understand that. Safe for them or potentially safe for other people. We understand that. But surely a case-by-case basis is much safer than this blanket policy, which clearly results in extraordinary harm being done to this population. And actually, even within that system, we find that Hutu and colleagues, there are ways that we can attend to this by providing training, by helping correctional staff and prison officers to understand what it is to be a transgender inmate, what the risks are for transgender and gender diverse inmates, to be able to provide simple affirmative interventions in their interactions by just using the name and pronouns that this person has chosen that is right for them. We can have a positive impact on their lives by giving them reasonable access to the healthcare that they require, by making sure that we are affirming in their interactions, and as this UK study highlighted, simply listening to them as correctional staff, as prison officers, as staff in prisons, simply taking the time to understand a person's perspective, to listen to them and to respect them makes a huge impact on people's well-being. And so these are very simple things that we could do. How much would it cost to do a huge round of trainings in prisons in the US or in the UK or across the world, right? The reason we don't do it, I think, is because we don't think of this population as one deserving of our attention, but it clearly is, particularly transgender people of color in extraordinary need. We must make sure that we attend to their needs in prison. And there are clearly ways that we can do that. So if we come together, if we look to the literature, and if we if we humanize transgender and gender diverse inmates, realize that they are people in great deal of need, and that we have not only a responsibility but the opportunity to improve the lives of people in our care, then maybe we can create a world where everyone can find a place to belong. Thanks so very much for joining me, everyone. This one was quite a challenging one. I hope you're still with me. If you are still with me, thanks very much. You're one of our true members of our community, and you are very, very welcome here. Hey, this was tricky, but look, I think that we can do this together. We can make a world where everyone can find a place to belong. I believe in us, and with you and I working together, I think we can make it happen. Thanks so very much for joining me. This is Classroom Psychology. You are very, very welcome here, and I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.